Professor Dr. Timo Meynhardt is the Dr. Arend Oetker Chair of Business and Psychology and Leadership at the Leipzig Graduate School of Management, as well as the Director of the Center for Leadership and Values in Society at the University of St. Gallen, Switzerland. Professor Meynhardt's research is focused in the field of public value and the application of the concept in business and administration. He has developed a public value scorecard, which I assume he's going to tell us about, to measure public value creation along 5 dimensions. We're truly delighted to welcome Dr. Meynhardt here today as our first keynote speaker, and look forward to hearing new insights and ideas from outside our cultural community by and large as we begin our 3 days of conversation and discussions about the topic of relevance and cultural organization. So without further ado, I will hand this over to Timo to begin.
Okay, thank you, Judy. Thanks, John, for inviting me, for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you. And I said, regardless, whatever it takes, it should be possible. And I'm glad that it's going to happen now. In the next 25 minutes or so, I shall talk a bit. In the next half an hour or so, we have 60 minutes, and in total discuss ideas and hypotheses and how all of this can be used for your work, what I'm going to tell. As John nicely introduced, I'm a public value scholar. Since a decade or so, I do public value research, try to measure what's possible, try to convince and persuade people that a public value perspective is productive and useful. And my talk is not to persuade you, it's rather an invitation. It's an invitation to shift attention towards something which has deep roots in our cultural history, even back to Aristotle, the common good, the church-like, the liberals. In whatsoever philosophy you find this kind of idea which we today frame with the term public value. What I'm going to talk is something I also have a presentation prepared. I'd like to share now. Hopefully it works. All of what I'm going to say is, I have the presentation mode as well, deeply kind of influenced of psychological thinking, because I was trained as a psychologist, and everything I'm going to talk is based on this assumption: public value is a matter of consciousness. It's a matter of fact, of course, but it emerges out of interpretation, out of meaning making. It's a very subjective category. And the issue 10 years ago and now is, while 10 years ago nobody would really take this seriously in terms of it's too subjective, it's too psychological, it has shifted a lot, and I will tell you how we frame this kind of thinking to articulate subjectivity in a way that society can talk about it. And public value as a matter of perception also comes into being while people perceive, interpret, make meaning. This kind of idea, public value is what the public values. This is not just a play on words. We can discuss this afterwards. I guess it's provocative for some people, but I'm sure not in the cultural sphere, because to me you are experts for dealing with subjectivity and celebrate even subjectivity and frame it. And this kind of idea is not so much a problem of transferring this notion of what cultural institutions can contribute. This is where I will focus on in my talk, titled "How Individuals Flourish in Community," which kind of rephrases the old idea: there's no I without a we. The I, any individual identity, personality, rests up on the shoulders of the social system. And what we do is articulating this in a new way, what has been already been there since humankind talks about itself, live together to cooperate, overcoming wars, finding peace. As long as groups, as collectives are there, public value issues have been already around. Maybe not with this term, but still we have an old paradigm kind of rejuvenated. And I wish to start with 2 hypotheses. And I'm also prepared, of course, to defend those hypotheses, also to discuss with you. The first one is very condensed idea to say, if complexity is a challenge, public value is the answer. And what I mean by saying this is our today's problems in business, in politics, in culture are not solvable at the same level as they emerged. This is also an old insight, but moving our thinking on a macro level, and public value is addressing the macro level, helps us to simplify complexity. In our world, which is not just complicated, which is complex, this kind of simplifying is something also very dangerous. At the same time, the critique on enlightenment, the critique on rational inquiry, on scientific truths has been challenged as well. And riding the wave of public value is also something we need to be very responsible, because public value means simplifying. To go on a macro level means to go on a values level. And values are never true. They are just there, and they exist because they are accepted. That's why the sentence public value is what the public value is so not so cozy at the second glance. It sounds nice, but actually it's quite a challenge for all of us. And the idea is, if complexity is a challenge, public value is the answer. To shift discussions also in the cultural sphere, we'll come back to this, on the level of what's not just in for the individual, but for the collective. And this interplay, and this is the second hypothesis, is addressed more specifically to your rearm. Cultural institutions, to me, are by definition, we can discuss this, might be too provocative or maybe too trivial, I don't know, because I'm not an expert in your field. Cultural institutions, to me, are public value institutions. Are public value by nature, by their very value creation, if I use this term from the business world, because they help to creatively reflect on the complex relation between individual and society. It might not cover everything what you do in your institutions, but to me, this constant reflection on the existential necessities to flourish in community, barriers, resistance people experience in their life, in fighting society, in changing society. This is, to me, a relational construct. Public is a relational construct. It's not just in the people, it's in the relationships. And discussing this relationship, to me, is also already the value proposition of a cultural institution at large. Cultural institutions are public value institutions because they help articulate, they help to reflect on this relationship. It might sound a bit fundamental or even you would say too basic, but to me, it is possible to cover under this umbrella lots of discussions we see across the world, from identity politics to universal rights to the idea of boundary conditions of our existence. And based on this idea, public value is the answer to complexity, and cultural institutions by itself are public value institutions. There's already a promise to be fulfilled by cultural institutions, because the promise is we are here to stay because we help society come to terms with those ideas. And in my motto for this conference, I said, we are entering an ever more irrational state of affairs. We are in a post-enlightenment era, and irrationality will not decrease, it will rather increase. And to defend reason and enlightenment has become so hard, even harder. And I suspect, I hypothesize, it's not just me, lots of colleagues, social scientists hypothesize it's getting even more irrational. And keeping a middle ground by not overselling rational arguments of enlightenment and acknowledging there's something called intuition, there's the value thing. Public value, to me, is a term which can help to rationalize an irrational discussion, to rationalize irrational discussions, to find the language to articulate. Public value, to me, therefore, is not another normative umbrella. Not another normative umbrella. And where all this comes from is definitely a question: do we need this new term? Is it a new kid on the block, or just a fashion? The history tells that the term actually was invented by Mark Moore, now Professor Emeritus at Harvard Kennedy School. He'd now turned 75. our church has turned 75, and when Mark invented this term, it was intended to have a counter poison to say, or a counter argument to the private sector who was obsessed with shareholder value. And in his trainings, executive educations, people ask Mark, it's so easy for the private sector world, they have what they call shareholder value. Is there anything to attribute it to public institutions that they not just waste other people's money, if things like culture or so, but is there something on a more positive note? And then they came and say, well, if the private sector creates shareholder value, we create also something, and this then was called public value. In the beginning, it was meant as a positive notion in the post-Reagan era, with those sayings, the state is not part of the solution, state is part of the problem. When Margaret Thatcher told us there's no such thing as society, in those times, the term public value resonated a lot by in the first place in the US, and then came to UK, to New Zealand, and a number of other countries to kind of counterbalance the idea of liberal, individualistic, self-responsibility to show that we depend more than we think on our social environments. And since then, the term traveled a lot across countries, across nations, even across sectors. Now it's already, it's also established in the private sector, but still it has all those friends and brothers and siblings in our history: the common weal, the common good, the public benefit, the public interest, the bonum commune, general interest, and so on and so forth. They all have the same notion, still with different takes, different zeitgeists, different disciplines from philosophy, political science, or jurisdiction. They have different, but the general idea is there's something beyond ourselves which needs to be articulated, even if it is hard, if it is tough, if it's not easy. And these days we call it public value, as directed to something which partly kind of goes in the same direction, for example, with the public good. I'll give you an example of the public interest. While the public interest might be in attention, public value is realized public interest. Or let's take a public good, public space in town. Still, if people do not appreciate it, a public good turns not into public value. This is a new thing in the public value discussion, that we argue public value is only created once people feel it, see it, internalize it, not just cognitively, but also emotionally, with their guts, with their senses, as a holistic experience. And therefore, public value is, in a more narrow definition, the answer: what makes an organization valuable to society? And of course, I know my colleagues in sociology, what's such thing as society? Is there still a common notion of society? And so on and so forth. Nevertheless, we assume that every one of us has certain attitudes, values, kind of summarizes his or her experience in a city, in dealing with an organization, and therefore we can ask people, what's the public value of, for example, Goethe Institute? And by the way, we did so. One of our largest studies was for the Goethe Institute, also published in 2008. What's the public value of Goethe Institute? We may come back to this one. And all in all, public value kind of articulates the social function of an organization. The social function is something we tend to neglect, or we used to neglect, but now we start to rediscover this. It's not something unnatural, but it's something, and this is some bullet point characteristics, what this could mean for us, that this rejuvenized focus on the common good is also something which is not an extra, an add-on, or a para value creation, but it's the core. It's the core of everything, core business of a theater, core business of a museum. It's not just keep customers happy or visitors or audience alive and engaged, but contribute to the common good. And it's not restricted to public or private sector, it's true for every organization. By doing so, and I can tell stories how this changes, for example, institutions reporting, non-financial reporting. How many visitors we had last year, how much money we spent, how much money we saved. This kind of thinking is extended because it's a performance notion to say, let's say a public bath, a museum, a theater, an opera does create public value for a city, for a region, far beyond the budget savings or something. Very, very important to me is it's applicable in any type of in any type of society even. You might call it, there might be dysfunctional public value, pathological public value, but the public value theory itself is rather descriptive than normative, because it does not say what organizations should do. It says what they describe, what they are doing. Therefore, you could say public value theory is kind of opportunistic. Could say it's opportunistic, but still it's not arbitrary. And I will come to this, which might be if there's one thought in the public value theory as I pursue, which is, I'm not saying original, but rather new, is to upload in this formal empty space of public value, everything and nothing, upload some categories which make public value not arbitrary, and John already referred to Public Value Scorecard, make it measurable and comparable across institutions. Because the idea is, that's where my history as psychologist comes into play, the yardstick of everything we call public value should be basic human needs. Basic human needs, and psychology after 100 years and more, after Sigmund Freud and all the others, has some stable insight or some mainstream knowledge what human basic needs could be, or how we best describe those. And this is my next idea I want to introduce. If you talk about public value, we talk about asking people not what's the public value of the Goethe Institute, but we ask them according to certain dimensions. And now let me introduce those dimensions. And they are actually four dimensions. And you already see not just the moral ethical, but also hedonistic aesthetical dimension, that right from the start, the cultural moment, the aesthetical dimension is a mandatory part of every public value analysis, be it a private institution, a soccer club, a church, or a Goethe Institute. It's always a four-dimensional space when you talk about public value, meaning not restricted to a single one. And if you're good at one dimension and not good at the other one, you might have at least an ambivalent public value, or you might fail to convince the general public that the public value profile of your institution is kind of balanced. And let me walk you through the four dimensions. I start at 12 o'clock, so to speak, the moral ethical dimension. Moral ethical dimension, institutions get high grades once people feel that their services help to enhance, nurture people's self-evaluation. It focuses on things like respect, dignity, or human rights in a narrow sense. Nobody wants to be hurt. We want to be acknowledged in our being as we are, as a human being. There's a deeply universal dimension, or universal dimension deeply in us, ourself, and identity is mentioned. You could say, well, public value is already achieved once people feel they are enhanced in their self-evaluation, recognized and seen even, but this is just 20% of the equation, or 25% in this basic model. The second dimension goes back to avoiding pain and maximizing pleasure. This is actually the dimension we call hedonistic aesthetical. We might discuss the hyphen in between. I'm prepared to defend the hyphen between hedonistic and aesthetical. But still, for the time being, nobody wants to experience pain and rather achieve pleasure, joy, fun. And you already see that the first and the second dimension can be incommensurably at loggerheads. Something can be very moral, but not so much fun. And things can be very pleasurable, but not so morally decent. And you already see in our human psyche, our makeup, we are not simply rational optimizers, but we are rather complex human beings with competing values in us. And this is already one dimension where there can be a value conflict or a needs conflict. Third one is we want to kind of control. I'm not referring to a control freak, but we want to understand and have a view which allows us to predict events in our environment. And the pandemics was a tragic example when we lost control about our lives because we didn't know what's going to happen next. We couldn't control the virus because it was invisible. And this makes people depressive. This makes people angry. And the idea is we know that the apple typically falls from the tree to the bottom, not vice versa. And if you now look out of your window and you see a flying piano next to your window, it's rather unusual. And what I mean is, if we make experience which do not fit our framing, might disturb us. And institutions contribute to this utility function in our life if they have products, if they have things we feel supporting our life or give us what they call use value. Use value, typically a car takes me from A to B, or a smartphone allows me to phone this basic function as something which is attributable to what is called use value. We want to have coherence in our worldview. Last but not least is attributed to what goes back to our nature of being a social animal. We have a sense to belong to. We want to be a member of a group, not necessarily a couple relationship. It might be a family, a friendship, colleagues. We cannot survive more than 3 months, as people say, without social contact, social interaction. We need positive relationships in groups. And taken together, this self-evaluation, the hedonistical part, the utility function, and the positive relationship, this forms the space in which public value is negotiated. Because once an institution scores high in people's minds on all those 4 dimensions, they might go high on a scoring. It can be measured with questionnaires, surveys, scorecards, with interviews, a number of scientific methods how to come to an objective view on how people subjectively interpret a theater or a Goethe Institute or an opera house according to those dimensions. What we typically do, we come up with public value profiles, and those profiles then are spelling out the space in which a certain institution is located. I'd like to show you one example which is also publicly available, so you can afterwards also look at it. It's called the Public Value Atlas. It has been done for several years in Switzerland, in Germany, last year we did in Japan, and I hope you can see this. I have to switch the language. Judy, can you see it? I guess you can.
Yes, we can see it. It's quite small. We can see the green graphs, but can't read the wording next to it.
I shall. You did. I see. I switched to a website, but probably I have to do another way. Otherwise, wait. You should see something different. I referred to a website, but it didn't obviously work. Wait a second. I go to. Can you see now the black?
No, we're now seeing your PowerPoint.
Okay, this is not what you should see.
Platform.
Wait.
Just
see me. But
yep,
now
we just see you till you pull up your website, I guess. There we go.
Yes, I pull up the website. Yes, I pull up the website, and I hope it's getting larger and larger.
Yes, we can see it and read it.
Perfect. That's the so-called Public Value Atlas. It's just an example for a Public Value Scorecard where we ask tens of thousands of people and bring it to a list. I have the English version now. For example, to show this, you have the 4 dimensions. It's a utility function we call task fulfillment. Social cohesion, very important. To what extent a certain institution has a high social cohesion contribution. Quality of life, this is hedonistic aesthetical, and morality, this part of self-worth. And you see this, the 4 dimensions, this is scored alongside the 4 dimensions. The first one was the firefighters, same in Germany and in Japan, for example. And in the first ranks, all of them technical help, the Red Cross, some social institutions, partly state-funded, partly NGOs, federal police, a constitutional court, and so on and so forth. In the very first, in the top 10, you see also the diaconie, the church, 8 institutions, young researchers. You don't see companies. You see public broadcasting. You see an environmental institution. You see public broadcasting. Again, the churches in the very first ranks. You see UNICEF. You don't see anything like a private sector company. It's based on, by the way, those violin charts show the distribution of answers. If it is higher, it's more on the right. If it's lower, it's more on the left. And when we typically publish those studies, they get high public attention because institutions want to better understand why, for example, they have a low quality of life score or a high in morality. And I'll show you the very end, and then I go back to the presentation. Don't want to bother you with data in this realm. As you can see, at the top there were the firefighters that they shut the fire. At the very bottom, there's some institution who produce cigarettes, Marlboro or something on fire, and FIFA and Bild, a German tabloid, Deutsche Bank, UEFA, a soccer club institution in Europe. These are the lowest, and the firefighters and the public institutions are the highest. The 4 dimensions are then scored into a high score or an average score between 1.88, which is the lowest, up to almost 6, which is then the highest with the firefighters. I go back to this presentation just to give you a glimpse that it's not just fantasy, it's really measured. It's there, tens of thousands of people participate. There are more fine-grade versions, for example, as we did it with the Goethe Institute, which was, of course, not as crude as with this survey. There are interviews done, and what I suggest is thinking in those public value terms. Partly, we also introduced the 5th dimension. We would come back to this, John, if you like. You mentioned this in the beginning. To see oneself in a more than one-dimensional or two-dimensional space, in the public value space, and I predict, looking at the time and open discussion already, that this has consequences also for cultural institutions. I will come to. Before I do so, let me give you a last example, or a concrete, very illustrative example, when you might fail in measuring what citizens think or what customers think, because customer value or citizen value might not go hand in hand with public value. And one of the most famous examples to me is this one. When in 1985, Coca-Cola introduced a new Coke, there were things we would attribute today as shitstorm. We would say this was outrageous how the public responded, despite having done market research, having done interviews in total, as Coca-Cola said and pretended, with more than 200,000 people. They obviously failed because a couple of months later they had to take back this and go back to the old recipe, to the old bottle, since the public did reject it. At the turmoil of this conflict, there was a guy, you might remember him, Fidel Castro. He called it's a sign of American capitalist decadence that it is no longer able to produce a decent Coca-Cola. He was a big fan, as you can see, holding a bottle in his hand. The point I want to make is not just to explain this biggest marketing failure in history of marketing, as books say, just from a public value perspective, but public value perspective at least could have helped to see it in advance that this soft drink is not just a soft drink, it's a symbol of certain things, the American way of life, this typical symbolic capital ingrained in the product. And this is more than a utility function. It has also this belonging, the sense of belonging. It has this morality function. And if you see it in a 4-dimensional space, I predict Coca-Cola should not have a similar failure in marketing once they would have acknowledged the public value dimensions. And when we measure public value of Coca-Cola, they still get a decent but not a very high score. But nevertheless, the example should just show that it's in B2C, in direct interaction with customers, with audiences, to be acknowledged that there is just more value than the value at hand, more than just a task at hand that people need a soft tank for a decent price, but it's value loading, it's public value loading. Coming back and coming to an end in my idea is this also changes over time. It's never stable. For sustainability, for example, we have 50 years since the limits of growth have been published. Club of Rome, sustainability was not the topic in public value thinking 50 years ago. Now it's a huge topic. And currently we analyze, for example, how in Germany at design schools, public value considerations are ingrained in designers' education to see how things shifted over time. And sustainability is just one case in point. And going with this zeitgeist, I think the value added of public value focus, and this is coming to an end with my invitation, is a lens, is a narrative, as you might call it, help legitimize your institutions. We did it for the Goethe Institute, for example, help to reinterpret one social function. I said public value is helping a social function to be articulated, helping also to set and direct strategic orientation. And last but not least, this is something I want to emphasize and then full stop, attract or retain talent. As we see it in our studies, that people choose employers more than ever for the sake of being somewhere with a purpose. And I assume that you have a number of highly enthusiastic colleagues in your institutions, but still this motivation to work for a cultural institution needs something more than just a safe place and a decent salary. And to retain talent is public value related, since we see employer attractiveness is correlated with public value orientation of this institute. The more public value orientation of a museum, of an opera, for example, the easier it is to attract and retain talent, not just from towards the program, the audience, but also to your own employees. With having said this, it's almost 2 o'clock. I think I close here, hoping I have provided some provocative thesis or at least some insight we can now, and I invite you to discuss and helping me to answer the questions. Thanks a lot for your listening.
Thank you so much, Timo. That we would be clapping in person if we were in the room together. And I now invite anybody with a question or a comment, something that this made you think about, either to raise your hand or to put the question in the chat so we can think about how this work really makes us think about our work differently. So it looks like John is getting ready to ask a question. John, I don't know if you want to put it in the
part of the challenge of so many people, I see Norbert down there with his hand up, but I don't know that,
sorry. Okay,
I don't know that you can you can see him, so this is the problem. So we'll have to figure out a different way, but I'll kick off a question and then we'll turn to Norbert, I think would be a good way.
Perfect.
So thank you, Timo. This was really wonderful. So my question is that, as you alluded to, and as all of us have become painfully aware, as we live increasingly in a polarized society where people have not only different conceptions, but different and firmly held values and identities. So the question is, does that mean that we need to potentially create multiple non-overlapping indices of value. Because what I might consider public good may not be what somebody else considers public good. And so how do we start? Do we have to literally start creating these multiple indices with multiple percentages across multiple sectors of society in order to come up with a composite of perceived value, as opposed to this traditional one-size-fits-all model?
Thank you for this question, which makes me also sleepless, because there is, if I have the silver bullet, I would have presented it. It's so complicated. Yeah. My take is the following. From psychological viewpoint, if you, for example, follow this idea, it takes a village to raise a child. We are all products of our context. You do not need to entertain a Marxist view on social environment, helping only people to emerge as individuals. But from psychologically speaking, there is no I without a we. And we tended for a long, long time, in particular in the Western world, to tell ourselves in a totally exaggerated way that we are all so unique, so special, so individual, and did forget that we have some common ground. And the idea, for example, by Spencer Brown to say, what difference makes a difference? We could turn by saying, what difference, the difference that makes a commonality, by showing the common ground. And for example, in the pandemics, it was shown that air is also a social entity. Air is a common ground. Our biological nature, we are all vulnerable to the virus, for example. And to show this basic commonalities, to me, is a task which could help us to somehow rebalance this exaggerated individualistic view of we are all so different. I ask my students in lecture hall, who has a shelf from IKEA? Who has XYZ? And interestingly, they discover they are similar than they think. There might be a social class effect as well, but helping to see commonalities might help rebalance this exaggerated individualistic viewpoint. And whether this is attractive to some people and not attractive to others is up to the audience. As I said, public is an invitation to make us aware how vulnerable we are, for example, because this is a universal category. I'm totally with Judith Butler, who talks about this vulnerability as an existential commonality, and making cultural institutions as institutions where this is shown could help us overcome and rebalance this unbalanced individualistic view. John, this would be my first response to a very difficult question. And let me just one afterward. If we don't do it, others do it. Because this is also a secret of the populists of whatever area, left or right. They have easy answers, and they promise a collective well-being, which might oftentimes, I'll take it very diplomatic, threat our democratic orders. For example, if the guy, former president of the US said, "Make America great again," it was exactly appealing to a common narrative where people could hook in and find identity kind of places where to belong to. And those offers, I suspect, will increase, and cultural institutions could help to reflect on pros and cons of those promises.
Thank you. Thank you. We have a lineup of questions now. So first Norbert, and then Irina Knava. So Norbert, would you like to go next? Norbert Herwig needs to be unmuted, please.
Audio. So I hope you understand me now. Okay. So museums try to prove that they have got a societal impact. So, and I would like to know if there is, or if you see a difference between a societal impact and public value.
Yeah, the answer is yes, yes, and no. The construct public value moves in a space where other candidates, for example, also social impact, And impacting sounds as if we try to impact on something which is out there, which in a way is also true, because public value fosters us to think outside in, not just inside out. What's necessary, we do what's required to get applause maybe, but public value is more than getting applause from customers or audiences. Public value is an active, or is an idea of active, of making of society. No, what sorry, Mr. Herwig, I could say, no, I could say museums actually make society. There's making, it's not just an impact because there's something out there. We make society because we are society. It might sound simple, but this makes a lot with people in strategic discussions. We make society, like startups make society, because they help furnish new values by products, by programs. Museums make society. MMS, museums make society. This is more than just an impact. This is being part of a certain societal makeup. And this thinking goes back, for example, to Peter Drucker, father of modern management, who said, we are moving in times where organizations, be it political, religious, any type of organization, are the makers of our values. The entities where value is negotiated is the level of institutions. And if we take this seriously, every institution has a social function, therefore is part of society and is a maker. It's not just embedded passively, but is an active maker of society. And with this notion, I feel one can attract young people. They want to make a difference to the world. They have a gift to the world. This we can do it. We can co-produce. It has also an idea of co-production. And the idea of co-production, when we ask the citizenship or the population, do you agree or disagree? With my behavior, I can make a difference to the common good. In Germany, we have above 90% who say yes, meaning on a 6-point scale, at least a 4. You can say, well, this is kind of a lip service, but those numbers are increasing over time, have been increasing. Switzerland is 95%, Germany is 92%, for example. So there's a need to participate. There's obviously something we can unleash. It's not just a passive mass out there. And cultural institutions might be those who instill this or helps this hunger to be satisfied, because this goes to the empowerment discussion, which is also ambivalent. Empowerment is not just a good thing, it's ambivalent, but still this active making is also kind of emancipatory step, I would say. It's not just politics, it's every one of us.
Thank you. Irene Knava? Oops. Maybe if you can't unmute. Oh, there you are.
Yes, here I am. Thank you, Timo. I have a question. Can you combine the concept of public value with the UN sustainability goals?
Yes, thank you for this question. We tried to combine in several ways in our work. One was to try and see and map 16 or 17 goals to the basic dimensions. And we discovered it's a kind of an overlap, of course. They are much more, they are more complex SDGs. And we also formulate a critique towards the SDGs. Public value is a local concept, saying, I stick with this good institute example. If the public value of a good institute in Istanbul is a different one than in Kiev or Moscow, then it's okay, because public value is local, and we should not impose our values to other systems. And to me, and this is the main critique towards SDGs, SDGs are imposing things on cultures by assuming they are universal. You could say this is a very academic critique, but still, I would rather go out and ask in Istanbul, Moscow, and Kiev about the value of public value of Goethe Institute than simply to apply the SDGs, bearing in mind and knowing that SDGs are powerful because politics has kind of said it's okay. But to me, frankly speaking, SDGs have some imperialistic flavor. By imposing things, I would rather go out and ask people, first talk to them and think which has a lot of consequences. I'm not naive. because let's assume we now go to and measure the public value of Moscow's Goethe Institute. It's a different one probably than in Connecticut. I'm not sure whether in Connecticut it's Goethe Institute, but let's say the one in Istanbul. So SDGs are problematic because they assume something to be universal, which I doubt.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Janice Humphrey is next. You should be able to unmute, Janice.
Thank you. I was wondering if you have, with scorecard, usually after the scorecard you have this, do you have any examples of an institution that's made a difference and like built in their strategies and actually made a difference? And then again, how often would you say an institution should be looking at doing this scorecard?
Yeah. We could start with the second question. Thank you for the two questions. We have institutions doing it in evaluating every new initiative of strategic relevance. You have to have a business case, but you also have to have public value case. And sometimes they are opposing each other. So
Yes.
It depends on how many times you start new initiatives or projects to kind of avoid the Coca-Cola disaster, to give an example. Institution who did it, by the way, we are asked to do those studies in particular in times of crises when institutions are attacked. And I mentioned several times Goethe Institute. There was no accident that it was in 2007, 2008, and some people thought, we had a foreign minister who thought it's no longer necessary to have this kind of institution. We had this discussion, you might remember. And another example, which was much stronger, in Leipzig, where I teach, we have a soccer club called RB Leipzig, some of you may know, and they intended to buy the stadium. And the local politicians wanted to have a kind of, not testimonial, but a study. And we did a public value study, and this was not the only one, but it was one factor whether this soccer club could buy the stadium. So it made a difference in acquiring a facility. Or, excuse me, we did those for the Federal Labor Agency, a public sector institution, where they then allocate money and did a different controlling system to decide whether a certain agency is successful or not. They were not successful on integrating people in the labor market, but they were successful in the local labor market, but they sent it to the federal labor market. Still, the local people being dissatisfied and couldn't understand why the controlling numbers are okay, but public value is low. This initiates different discussions. A third example, a German company who was invested in China, in Foxconn, where we heard this terrible news that people commit suicide, go out of the window, jump out of the window. And the company had to decide whether to disinvest in Foxconn or let things produce at Foxconn. These are three examples where people had made decisions based on the studies.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you. And next we have Louisa and Louisa Ransom.
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Well, I guess my question is really about sort of if and how you balance these four aesthetics or dimensions that you were talking about. Because I've noticed that our audience seems to be drawn really strongly towards a kind of need for escapism, which I guess is maybe more within the hedonistic aesthetic, and perhaps the moral aesthetic currently seems to be sort of a little bit more difficult. And so I guess I'm wondering, like, should cultural institutions react to what the audience kind of wants or needs, or should cultural institutions rather be like kind of setting the tone within their programming? So should we be producing shows actively that we think will be popular versus what we think will really reflect kind of social conditions?
I guess I'm not too coward here by saying we need both. This setting the tone, we call it purpose. What's the purpose and our value proposition to the general public? And then let's see, beyond the stakeholder perspective, what is the value, the public value of this realized purpose? public value, you could say, is realized purpose. Once people get it what you want, it's okay. If not, we have a problem. And it's always back and forth. And public value is also a call for opening the window and asking. It's not a naive participative method. It's a method to get an outside-in perspective of what is accepted, what's maybe you would say a public value profile is not necessarily being nice to others. It can be also provocative in terms of challenging current moral attitudes. And this is what we also see, that those public value profiles have pros and cons, have conflicts. In itself, a public value profile is not consistent in terms of everything is nice. You can be high on the moral, but low on the political part. But at least you have this. I give you another example. We had a Chamber of Commerce in Hamburg. They were in a crisis and had to give themselves a rebirthing, and they had a nice purpose, what they intended to do. And then we asked politicians, we asked cultural people, we asked people from sports, from the media, what they think, what they see. And the point is, this idea, public value is what you see, perceive, and if you are not able to get in their hearts, public value is not created. Or more pathetically, there's no public value in the dark. Public value has to be communicated. Public value, if nobody knows it, it's not there.
Yeah. Thank you. And we'll have next Chung Fei and then Vera.
Hi. I believe one important aspect of a cultural institution is as a change agent to initiate and empower change in the audience and in the environment. How do we incorporate this aspect into your four-dimensional framework of evaluation?
There are a couple of strategies to include this dynamic impact, this dynamic dimension. Being a change agent itself needs legitimization. Not just because you are there, you have the authority. You have to fight for this authority to be regarded as a change agent. And this has also been accepted or legitimized budget-wise, but also in terms of reputation, for example. Even a function of irritating a society with certain new perspective, unusual artists needs some societal grounding, and therefore this being acknowledged as a change agent is also a public value dimension, meaning in our profile, you would see it, the current state and the ideal state. You ask not just for the dimension as such, we also ask, what would you like, where would you like to go? I could send a paper and I might send it to Judy and John to be distributed. There are 5 different methods of scorecards, how to apply it to also capture this dynamic question. If you ask me, what would be a simple low-key intervention to measure your own public value? Some of you may have heard of what is called the Net Promoter Score. Net Promoter Score, we developed a public value promoter score. It's just a single tiny question on the same scale with Net Promoter Score, and we find Net Promoter Score can be high. You recommend this museum to a friend or so, but the public value promoter score can be low because you say it's good fun, but actually society doesn't need it. We cannot afford this anymore. The public value promoter score is this most condensed version of public value scorecard, and if you do it several times, you could see whether this agency or this change agent function is acknowledged or not. In the long run, and this is maybe the last comment, in the long run, you can't sustain a business or you can't grow against public value. I'm not saying you have to go with the crowd, but in the long run, if there's an alienation with the crowd, it's also not feasible anymore.
Yeah. Thank you. And Vera.
Thank you very much. Thank you also to Timo. That was super interesting. And I probably have a nerdy academic question here, which is also related to Inga's question in the chat, what the method is. How do you find out the dimensions? I think that's also something that Inga asked, because my question is, I guess that you ask questions to people to find out what public value is. And you said that public value is local, but thinking about the German population, they are not the same as well. You have a lot of people coming from different countries all over the world. And I was asking myself if the instruments that you use are in a way culturally sensitive. So would people with a certain background coming from one region of the world living in Germany maybe give different answers to your questions than people coming from other regions of the world? And how do you deal with that issue?
Yeah. Thank you for this question, which it's very familiar to me, this question. Of course, we measure variance, and we see that variance is often lower than we think. We underestimate commonalities. And again, my point is, like with Judy Butler's idea, we all are vulnerable as existential beings. And still, we distinguish whether, for example, the young and the old in Germany, East and West, the richer and the poorer, low income, high income, how they differentiate. And we find, of course, differences, and we analyze along different stakeholder groups. And for example, we find women are rather prepared to sacrifice salary for the sake of working at an institution which is high on public value. This is also with sustainability. Women are change drivers. Change drivers are women. If women start, I don't know to exaggerate, but we can show those differences empirically, and still we have all the problems of composing, of aggregating. If you're on this academic path, public value is serious, is theoretically speaking not something one can simply aggregate. To ask 10,000 people, derive a mean score, and then it's 5 point something. But it's the closest we can get to do a mean scoring. All other methods, if you want to ask larger groups, it's simply impossible. Bearing in mind that public value is not just an entity, like a metaphysical cloud above us, we are all part of it. Every day we reproduce public value by our behavior, from property rights to greeting ceremonies, from relationship attitudes. We reproduce public value every day, even in a couple relationship, in a dyadic relationship. There's something shared which is not there if there's only one person there. It's a collectively emerging property where we ask people about their view on this collective, bearing in mind it has very strong limits, also psychological methods how to measure it. But at least we try, and maybe sometimes the sheer number or the score is not so important. Then to shift managers, politicians, people in charge, their mind towards, hey, there is such thing as society. And I was so happy is the wrong term, but I could send you this paper when Boris Johnson, early 2020, in a self-quarantine said, oh, Margaret Thatcher was wrong. There is such thing as society. And to me, it's actually a huge shift to acknowledge there's something beyond ourselves, beyond our families. There is societal climate, there is social security, there is kind of social peace. And now we see, for example, in war times, to me, there's no public value in war. Peace is the basic necessity for the common good. Otherwise, we cannot flourish. War destroys also public value. And I start writing about this, how the notion of peace is correlated to the notion of public value, and to make us aware of the preconditions of public value. What peace means, for example, is also something where I see cultural institutions having a task to reflect on this relationship, as I said in the beginning, individual and society. And whether it's so differentiated, if the variance is a bit lower or higher, is maybe less important than the general idea there's something in common good. And maybe even would be the worst thing when somebody would say, this is public value, full stop. In democracy, it has always to be fluid. It always has to be incomplete. And this incompleteness is all the beauty of public value.
Thank you. Laurie Kilgore-Walsh. Oops. Oh, okay. Then let's go to Volker then, Volker, and then come back to Lori. Volker Schonert, if you would like to unmute. Yeah.
Yes, I'm here. Yeah, my question is the concept of public value is for cultural institutions to find out and what or to make a choice between to concentrate on the content, for example, the collection or the science or whatever for museums, for example, or the orientation on the public to be more entertaining, to attract more visitors. And what is the choice, what to do to increase your public value? I mean, of course, you can't really answer the question, I know, but I just want to shed a light on the difficulty to define public value, because it's always an argument between the conservative people in the museum, for example, or the more progressive people.
As long as one starts, to me at least, I would argue to say there's a layer, there's a dimension we should better grasp, better understand, without presuming or pretending then we can fully grasp it. But there's something, a collective quality called public value, which might either be something in this, you use the term entertaining. I would also use for this the term to bring a public into existence, to make us aware there's a public sphere. There was recently in a book, Le Leviathan, with several chapters, where Jürgen Habermas, the master of the public sphere, he wrote his habilitation about this structural change of the public sphere, and he came back and said, well, we have again to revisit what the public sphere means, not just public spaces and public property, but to rejuvenate what our heritage tells us, that we are more than individuals. And if you say museums helps to establish, to bring public into existence, I would have loved to invent this term, to call a public into existence, but this term was already invented by John Dewey in 1926 in his book Public Dimension, to call a public into existence. To me, museums are a case in point, maybe the best case in point, next to other cultural institutions, how to call a public into existence. And you might call it entertaining. I would rather prefer a more neutral word. This is the part, but the other part on the program to confront us with collective consequences of individual action, for example. And on both sides, I would make a public value proposition by arguing, let's take into account this layer. It's not a transcendental dimension, but in any case, it transcends our individual being, or makes us aware that our individual being is so highly dependent on the social environment, not just for kids and elderly people who need help, but also for everyone, arguing that public value could also be viewed as an anti-Robinson Crusoe narrative. We cannot survive in isolation.
All right, it goes in my direction, but sometimes I'm evaluating museums, and sometimes I think people or the professionals, they think we are the chosen one. We know what the public has to know, and we decide, and we make the choice, and we don't need to ask people or do any surveys or whatever. I know it. What is the best for them, and think it is not said, but it is often they think in this way, and it's a critical point for me, because the museums in Germany and all over the world, we have to think about their relevance in the future, and they have really to change the attitude.
Thanks. I mean, maybe the highest or the best version is what Michelle Obama said. If they go low, we go high. No wonder. I mean, if you have this arrogant attitude, to me, it's so arrogant, we don't have to wonder that people take other choices.
Yeah.
So
Thanks.
thank you very much. I don't know if you can tell, but Timo is just healing from having been sick, and I can hear that his voice is starting to get tired. And this was such a valuable way to begin this conference, talking about public value and relevance. And I know that we will bring a lot of your ideas into our discussions over the next 3 days. And I certainly hope that you can join us for some of those conversations. So we're now going to take a break and